So let's take a look at Edward the Confessor and the rivals to his rule. First problem he's got is the House of Godwin. Now this means like the Godwin family. So why were they so powerful? Well, they owned huge amounts of land given to them during the reign of King Canute. They had a lot of family members who owned earldoms. For example, Harold owned Wessex and Tostig owned Northumbria from 1055 to 1065 when there was a rebellion against him, which we'll discuss later on in this video. They also, partly due to their land, they also had huge amounts of wealth. They owned a lot of land and therefore could tax it, so they could make a lot of money off the land. Huge landholding made the Godwins very rich, almost equal to the king in terms of their wealth. They'd also had a series of political marriages. Edward the Confessor, for example, the king, had married Godwin's daughter in exchange for Godwin's help with the throne, which made them related by law, which gave the Godwin family a huge amount of power. In summary, Harold Godwinson is the brother-in-law of Edward the Confessor. Edith Godwin married Edward the Confessor. Harold Godwinson's sister is married to Edward the Confessor. They also have military strength. The Thanes, who control parts of the land, had been given it by the earls. So because the Godwin family were earls, this meant they had a lot of Thanes working for them, and the Thanes were the military class. So Thanes got land off earls in return for fighting for the king or earl. The Godwins had a lot of earldoms and therefore had a huge amount of military force at their disposal. What we see during the reign of Edward the Confessor is him trying to initially throw off the influence of the Godwins, trying to get himself more power. When do we see this? Well, we see the rebellion of Earl Godwin in 1050 and 1051. Let's have a look at it. So it all starts when, or rather, Edward had shown signs early on in his reign, as I mentioned, of trying to reduce the influence of the Godwin family. What happens here is a French embassy, so some royal visitors from France, had been sent to England. However, they were assaulted in Earl Godwin's earldom, Wessex. So Edward the Confessor wanted discipline, so tells Earl Godwin to punish the attackers. He says, these are our French guests and people in your earldom attacked them. You need to punish the aggressors. Godwin, however, refuses to punish the Anglo-Saxons because he's their earl. He's the earl of the Anglo-Saxon lands. He shouldn't be having to protect French people on his land. So Godwin refused to do what Edward asked. So therefore, Edward the Confessor and the other earls managed to work together to get rid of Earl Godwin. In summary, a French embassy visits, is attacked by Anglo-Saxons. Edward the Confessor tells Earl Godwin to punish the Anglo-Saxons responsible for it, and Earl Godwin says no. So the earls and Edward the Confessor work together to get rid of Earl Godwin, and they think that's problem solved, that's job done. That's in 1050. However, just 1 year later, Earl Godwin rebels, leading Edward to ask for William's support against Godwin. So what happens here is basically Earl Godwin sails back up the River Thames and says, I want my earldom back. And what happens then is Edward the Confessor says, okay, Earl Godwin, you can have your earldom back, but I want 2 members of your family as hostage, and they will be sent to live with my friend William of Normandy. So Wulfnoth and Hakon are the names of the hostages. They are sent to live with William of Normandy, and this is how Edward the Confessor tries to reduce the power of the Godwins. It's also believed that what William of Normandy wants in exchange for this is that he wants the throne. So according to Norman sources, this is when William was allegedly promised the throne and Godwin was exiled. Godwin was returned to power though in 1051 without any intervention from Normandy, and his sons were given the most powerful positions in the kingdom. Godwin had threatened war. So Edward promised the English throne to William of Normandy after his death in return for William's support against Godwin. This shows the ambition of the House of Godwin. So in summary, 1050, Earl Godwin refuses Edward the Confessor's orders and is exiled. 1 year later, he sails back up the River Thames, demands his earldom back, or there will be war. Edward the Confessor says, okay, you can have your earldom back, but I want 2 members of your family as hostage, Wulfnoth and Hakon, and they are sent to live with William of Normandy, and that's why William of Normandy is initially promised the throne, we believe, in 1051. Edward the Confessor does this because he believes by having 2 members of the House of Godwin hostage, they will have less influence over him. So, what we then see is the growing influence of Harold Godwinson. So Harold Godwin, or Earl Godwin, dies in 1053. So Harold Godwinson, over the course of the next few years, it grows in power, increases in power, even getting the title of Sub-Regulus following his and Tostig's campaign and assassination of the Welsh King Gruffydd of Llywelyn. He gets the title Sub-Regulus, or Under King. And then one of the things that Harold Godwinson is asked to do in this role is go on this embassy to Normandy. Now, there's a couple of variations on what the story is here. We think it takes place in 1064 or 1065. The point is, Harold Godwinson is sent by Edward the Confessor to Normandy on a mission. This shows he's a trusted advisor. And then the story gets a little bit confusing. So, whilst Harold Godwinson was operating as Sub-Regulus, he was sent on an embassy or royal visit to Normandy. Harold Godwinson claims that the purpose of this was to rescue the hostages mentioned earlier, his cousins Wulfnoth and Hakon, from 1051. I should say Hakon, from 1051. William, however, claims that the purpose of this embassy was that Harold went to renew the promise made by Edward in 1051, and the official embassy was to confirm William as his successor. Whilst Harold Godwinson is on this embassy, he swears an oath to help William become the King of England once Edward the Confessor dies. The problem here is we don't know if Harold Godwinson willingly swore this oath or if he is forced to. Anglo-Saxons will say that Harold Godwinson was forced to sign this oath, and Normans will say that he chose it voluntarily. If, though, William of Normandy was telling the truth, it would mean that Harold Godwinson was an oath breaker and therefore would be punished by God and sent to hell. The significance of this oath is that it gives legitimacy to William's claim to the throne. He has been promised the throne allegedly in 1051 by Edward the Confessor, and this promise has been renewed and strengthened in 1064 or 65. Getting closer to the Battle of Hastings, we also see a rebellion against Tostig Godwinson in 1065. Now, this is an interesting event. Tostig had been the Earl in the Danelaw since 1055, but he'd basically run it as a tyrant until 1065 when he faces a rebellion. So just to be clear, Edward the Confessor is still the King of England. The Godwinson family still have huge amounts of influence, and in 1065, Tostig, the Earl of Northumbria, faces a rebellion. Let's have a look at what happened. So, Tostig had been made Earl of Northumbria in 1055, Northumbria in the Danelaw, so has Viking descendants there. And the thing with Tostig is he makes no attempt to integrate into the society. So he's from the south, it's a different culture in the north, in the Danelaw, and he's made no attempt to integrate into their society. The Danelaw would rather be run by somebody from Northumbria, somebody from the Danelaw, and Tostig doesn't care. He's not made any attempt to integrate. Tostig showed no respect for the culture of the Danelaw, even taxing them heavily, which was problematic as they were used to paying lower geld taxes as they were Viking descendants. So the geld tax, remembering, that was introduced to pay off Viking raids. So people in the Danelaw, as they were descended from Vikings, usually paid lower geld tax because they themselves were descendants of Vikings. So why would they pay a tax that had been used to keep them away or pay them off? He was ignorant of the culture in the north, and he did not take revenge against King Malcolm III of Scotland when he raided the Danelaw. So Malcolm III of Scotland goes into the Danelaw, raids, pillages and steals, and Tostig doesn't take any revenge basically because he's busy mates with him. This was an insult to the Viking heritage of the inhabitants of the Danelaw. They want revenge against Malcolm. They want a scrap. They are Viking warriors and they want to take their revenge, but Tostig doesn't let them. This is an insult to their culture. So they're annoyed at Tostig for this. He's corrupt. He invites political rivals round to his home and then simply has them assassinated whilst they're having dinner. Why can he get away with this? Well, because the legal system is Wehrgeld and he's got enough money to pay it. The Northumbrians eventually get fed up, so they march on York and killed Tostig's housecarls. Tostig himself runs away and escapes. What happens next is where it gets interesting for our in terms of our little competition for the throne, in terms of our succession crisis. Harold Godwinson turns on his brother. He doesn't help Tostig when he faces this rebellion, and he goes against Edward the Confessor. Why would Harold Godwinson do this? Well, what Edward the Confessor does in response to this rebellion against Tostig is he sets up a meeting, and Edward the Confessor tells his high-ranking earls to crush the rebellion against Tostig. It doesn't matter that Tostig's been a complete idiot and brought this on himself. Edward the Confessor says, crush this rebellion and reinstate Tostig as earl. However, Harold Godwinson, Tostig's own brother, ignores this. He delays and disobeys the command, and he ensures that the other earls do as well. Why would he do this? Why on earth would he not help his brother, and why does he ignore the king? Well, very simply, if you look at the date, we're in 1065. Edward the Confessor is weak and frail, so it seems he would die soon. So Harold Godwinson's kind of gambling that Edward's not got long left here. Harold Godwinson himself wants to inherit the throne, so didn't want to have conflicts with Northumbria so close to potentially taking over the country. So he thinks, why would I want to go and crush a rebellion in the north and fight with the people in the north when in a few months' time I'm going to have to govern them? He thinks if I go against them now, it's going to be a problem when I become king. So he thinks I'm not going to fight them and I'll have a more peaceful transition into kingship in the future. The other thing is, Tostig himself would have been a potential rival to the throne when Edward the Confessor died, and he's just ruined his own chances of becoming king. So that's one rival to the throne had actually removed themselves from the succession.